It was a bright summer morning in Munich. The air was still cool, touched with dew, but the square was already crowded. Merchants had set up stalls along the edges. Families came early. Children perched on shoulders. There was laughter in the air, and bread being sold warm from the oven. This wasn't just a gathering. It was an event. The city had seen many things over the centuries, but few days drew this kind of crowd. Everyone had heard the rumors, and everyone wanted to see them die. At the center of it all stood a wooden scaffold, flanked by executioners sharpening their tools. The city guard kept the perimeter clear, but no one tried to get closer than allowed. This wasn't a day for protest. It was a day for punishment. The victims were already in the tower above, barely alive. They had been pulled from their cells in the early hours, their bodies shattered by weeks of torture. But today wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about a show of strength. The family that was about to die bore a name no one cared about a few months ago, Papenheimer, a name that would, for a brief moment, become infamous, a name the state would carve into the minds of its people through steel and fire. There were 5 of them: Paulus, the father, Anna, his wife, their 2 grown sons, Gumbrecht and Michael, and the youngest, Hansel, 10 years old. The boy hadn't been scheduled for death that day. He was there to watch. And then, perhaps, to remember. It's easy, centuries later, to see this story through the distance of time, a relic of a dark era, a statistic buried in the books. But what happened in Munich that day wasn't ancient. It wasn't foreign. It was, in its essence, horrifyingly modern. A family crushed under the wheels of state power. A public convinced by fear. A lie transformed into truth through repetition, violence, and spectacle. The real story didn't start on the scaffold. It started long before, in the mud and filth of the Bavarian countryside, where the Papenheimers lived a life no one envied and few would defend. Their story is not one of witchcraft or murder. It is one of poverty, prejudice, and power. And unless we're willing to stare directly into it, we risk repeating it again and again, under different names and banners. Let us go back not to that morning in Munich, but to the world that allowed it to happen. In the year 1600, Bavaria was a land choked by fear. Fear of heresy, fear of outsiders, fear of chaos. The Protestant Reformation had torn through Europe like wildfire, and now the Catholic Church, with dukes and bishops at its side, was determined to push back, not with dialogue, not with mercy, but with fire and iron. The Duke of Bavaria, Maximilian the Roarer, saw himself as a holy warrior, a man anointed by God to cleanse his land of corruption. But corruption, to men like Maximilian, was never found in the palaces or the banks. It festered in the gutters, among the beggars, the travelers, the dirty, the poor, the ones with no voice. That's where the Papenheimers lived. Paulus Papenheimer was a latrine cleaner, not a farmer, not a merchant. He emptied chamber pots for a living. His wife, Anna, had inherited the wrong kind of legacy. Her father had been a gravedigger, a job people whispered about with disgust. Their sons had grown up hauling waste, digging holes, shoveling whatever filth needed shoveling. They didn't go to school. They didn't read. They didn't belong anywhere. Their lives were mobile, wagon-bound, moving from town to pick up work nobody else wanted. They slept where they could, in barns, alleys, the edges of cemeteries. They were what society labeled as marginal, not quite criminal, not quite human, just there, always around, always unwelcome. And they were Protestants. That alone made them targets. In Catholic Bavaria, being Protestant wasn't just a theological disagreement, it was a rebellion. It was sedition. even if you didn't preach or protest, even if you just kept to yourself. The moment you stepped out of line, morally, socially, or religiously, you were fair game. The Papenheimers didn't even have to step out of line. They were born outside it. There were no photographs back then, no written testimony from the family themselves, but we can piece together who they were by what others said about them: filthy, wandering, suspicious. The kind of people whose guilt would never be questioned if the finger was pointed. To the church, they were heretics. To the town, they were strangers. To the court, they were nobodies. And nobodies make the perfect scapegoats. In the months leading up to their arrest, Bavaria was gripped by paranoia. A wave of child disappearances, strange illnesses, crops failing, livestock miscarrying. People needed someone to blame, and the ruling class needed a demonstration, something to prove they were in control. The Papenheimers didn't stand a chance. It wouldn't take much to bring them in, just a whisper, a rumor, a lie from a man already sentenced to die. They didn't know it yet, but their fates had already been sealed. But beyond the facts, the religion, the jobs, the clothes, there was something deeper that marked the Papenheimers for destruction. They made people uncomfortable. They reminded the townsfolk of the things they feared most: poverty, powerlessness, and being forgotten. When Paulus walked down the street with his broom and barrel, no one greeted him. When Anna came into town to beg for stale bread, women clutched their children tighter. When Gumbrecht and Michel asked for work, eyes narrowed, voices lowered. They weren't seen as neighbors. They were walking warnings, evidence of what could happen if you didn't follow the rules, or if fate simply chose not to favor you. And it wasn't just poverty that set them apart. It was motion. The Papenheimers moved. That alone was dangerous. In a world where people were born, lived, and died within the same few miles, anyone who traveled was automatically suspicious. Why didn't they settle? What were they running from? What secrets did their wagon hide? The truth was simple: they had nothing to settle with. No land, no family connections, no dowry. They moved because they had to, because staying in one place meant wearing out their welcome. The town would say, "You've worked here long enough, time to go," and they would go. This lifestyle, nomadic, poor, unchurched, and unprotected, was already dangerous in the eyes of the law, but in 1600 it became fatal. The flames of the Counter-Reformation were burning across Europe. The Catholic Church, shaken by decades of Protestant resistance, had entered a phase of militant purification. Rulers like Maximilian weren't just political leaders, they were spiritual warriors. And in their minds, sin was like rot if not cut away. It would spread. So they began to cut. Not at the top, never at the top. The rich were too well connected, God, the merchants too valuable, Ika. The clergy too sacred. No, the blade fell on the poor, on the wandering, on the voiceless, on the Papenheimers. And in this society where rumor spread faster than fact and silence was mistaken for guilt, being accused was the same as being condemned. The Papenheimers didn't know any of this as they traveled from village to village. They weren't reading the papers. They didn't attend council. They didn't overhear court gossip. All they knew was work, weather, hunger. And then one day, a man already sentenced to hang opened his mouth and the storm began. It happened in February 1600 in the middle of a cold, still Bavarian night. The Papenheimers were camped near the edge of the village of Altmanstein. They had spent the day working cleaning latrines behind a church and hauling waste from the town's butcher stalls. Nothing glorious, but it paid enough for stale bread and a dry place to rest. Their wagon creaked beneath a tarp, patched with scraps of linen and rope. A fire crackled low in the frost, and Hansel had just fallen asleep curled next to his mother. Then came the boots, dozens of them, iron against stone, voices shouting, the creak of torches flaring to life. Paulus didn't have time to grab his coat before the soldiers tore through the canvas. Anna screamed. Mikkel stood up and was struck in the face with a rifle butt. Gumbrecht tried to run. He didn't get far. Hansel cried, and the men who had come for them didn't explain a thing. They didn't have to. Chains were thrown around their wrists, their ankles. The family was dragged barefoot into the snow. Neighbors peeked through shutters, watching the arrest without stepping in. In towns like Altmanstein, speaking up for a family like the Papenheimers could make you next. They were marched for days over frozen roads, through forests, across rivers stiff with ice. No food, no change of clothes, no heat but the breath from their mouths. When they arrived in Munich, they weren't given a cell. They were given a hole. The Falcon Tower was a squat, medieval fortress in the heart of the city. Its lower chambers hadn't seen sunlight in centuries. The walls were thick, the ceilings low, the air thick with rot. Rats moved freely through the corridors, feeding off discarded bread and worse. It was here the Papenheimers were thrown. No charges read, no lawyer present, no explanation offered. Outside, the city buzzed with talk of heretics, witchcraft, murdered infants, dead livestock, evil among them. The press, what little of it existed, repeated official whispers as fact, and the court had already chosen the script. The Papenheimers were not being held for investigation. They were being staged for destruction. The authorities began the process that same week. First, they separated the family. They put each one in a different part of the tower. They told each that the others had already confessed, that the mother had cursed her own children, that the father had trafficked with the devil, that the sons had taken part in baby killings. They told Hansel his family would burn and that if he didn't speak, he would burn with them. This was not interrogation. It was a psychological siege. The torment hadn't even turned physical yet, but the fear, the silence, the cold, the lies was enough to break the strongest, and the Papenheimers were not strong. They were tired, poor, uneducated, and now completely alone. Back then, in Bavaria, you didn't need a confession to be found guilty. You just needed fear. Enough fear to drown out the doubt. Enough fear to quiet your neighbors. Enough fear to make a public execution seem like justice. And the court had already decided this family would not survive. The first scream came from deep below the tower. Paulus was the first. He was pulled from his cell at dawn, blindfolded, shackled, and taken down a stairwell that reeked of mold and old blood. The chamber he entered had no windows, just iron hooks, leather straps, and a rack made of oak and rusted steel. The guards didn't speak to him. The torturers didn't explain. They began without warning. They started with strappado. His wrists were tied behind his back, then lifted by a pulley until his arms tore from their sockets. He didn't confess. Not yet. Next came the pincers, glowing orange from the coals, used to tear chunks of flesh from his chest and inner thighs. Then the rack, his body stretched inch by inch until his joints snapped like branches, somewhere between the third and fourth turn. Paulus broke. He confessed, not to anything specific, just whatever they wanted. That he had made pacts with Satan, that his wife had participated in demonic rites, that his sons had helped kill babies, that they had all ridden to secret Sabbaths through the sky with demons. His voice cracked with every word, but the notary wrote it all down neatly, in Latin every grotesque fantasy treated as fact. Then it was Anna's turn. They stripped her naked before male guards, cut her skin with knives, heated irons until they hissed against her flesh. They tore at her breasts with hooks, burned her thighs, beat her with clubs. She confessed too, under agony. She admitted to incest, sorcery, infanticide. None of it was real. But in the darkness of the dungeon, reality didn't matter. The script was being followed, and the more horrific the confession, the more holy the punishment would appear. Gumbrecht and Michel were taken separately. They tried to hold out, young, strong, defiant, but no man can hold against the rack forever. Their joints dislocated, their ribs cracked, their fingernails were pulled out. One of them bit through his own tongue to stop from screaming. But they screamed anyway. Their confessions echoed the others. Satanic rituals, poisoning wells, meeting the devil in the woods, dancing around fires with animal blood. The torturers nodded. They'd heard it all before. What mattered was that the public would believe it had been true. And Hansel, they didn't torture him physically. Not yet. He was 10, but they brought him in to watch. He saw his mother bleeding on the floor, her body smoking from a hot brand. He saw his brothers strapped down, begging. He was told they were monsters. He was told he was next. And then they left him in the dark for days. Alone, cold, surrounded by rats and silence and the smell of urine and blood. Eventually, Hansel began to speak. He told the court what they wanted to hear, that his family had taken him to satanic rituals, that they had killed children, that he had seen the devil with his own eyes. None of it true, but when a child says it, people believe. By the end of May, the court had a full set of confessions. Signed, sealed, sanctified. The Papenheimers were now officially a demonic cult, a threat to Christendom, a stain that needed to be erased not just with death but with spectacle. Because the public needed to see it. They needed to feel safe again. Inside the Falcon Tower, time stopped meaning anything. There was no sunrise, no moonlight, just the echo of footsteps and the smell of burning flesh. Paulus tried to count the days, at first marking scratches on the stone with his fingernails, but the darkness swallowed the hours. The pain drowned the calendar. He prayed not for salvation, but for death, for silence, for the dreamless kind of end where the screams finally stopped. In the rare moments between torture sessions, he would close his eyes and imagine things that no longer seemed real. Anna laughing in the rain, Michel arguing over bread, Hansel picking wild berries beside the wagon. Those moments, once so ordinary, had become sacred now. In the dark, they were all he had. Anna was kept alone in a narrow cell barely wide enough to lie down. Her wrists bled from the iron cuffs that never came off. At night, rats scurried past her feet. She wasn't afraid of them anymore. What terrified her now were the voices. She began to hear her father's voice, long dead, accusing her of dishonoring his name. She saw shadows on the wall that looked like flames, though no fire had been lit. Her body was broken, but her mind was unraveling faster. The guards fed her just enough to keep her alive. They needed her breathing. They needed her bleeding. She was no longer a person, she was a symbol, a mother of demons. The court wanted her to look monstrous when they paraded her in public. And so, piece by piece, they stripped her humanity away. Michel had stopped speaking altogether. He responded to questions with silence or laughter, sometimes both. One guard joked that Michel was possessed, and the others laughed. But the truth was simpler and more tragic. His mind had simply let go. He spoke only when dreaming. He would murmur words like river or apple or home. Sometimes he called out for Anna, not knowing she was 3 cells down, sobbing into her own dress. Gumbrecht resisted the longest. He cursed his torturers. He spat on the floor. He said he would never give them what they wanted. But the rack doesn't care about defiance. The wheel doesn't negotiate. By the time they brought him back from the chamber, his shoulders were twisted, his knees shattered, and his jaw dislocated. He couldn't scream anymore. He couldn't even beg. They laid him in the dark and left him to rot. And Hansel, they gave him a candle. That was the only light he saw, one flickering stub placed on the floor of his cell. It didn't warm the room, it didn't chase the rats, but he stared at it for hours. He imagined it was the sun, the moon, the fire under his mother's stew pot. He named it Mama, and when it burned out, he wept so quietly that even the walls didn't hear. They brought him food, sometimes with maggots in it. They brought him water, sometimes tinted red, but no one brought him comfort. No one explained anything. He was 10, and the silence was louder than any scream. When they finally asked him questions again, he answered without protest. He said what they told him to say, that the devil came at night, that his mother kissed a snake that turned into fire, that his father had wings like a bat, that he had danced in the forest with dead children. It didn't have to make sense. It just had to sound like fear. The notary wrote it all down neatly, precisely, and when he finished, he looked at Hansel and said, "God have mercy on your soul." Hansel blinked. He didn't understand the words. He only understood one thing. It was almost over. July 29th, 1600. The sun rose over Munich with a strange energy in the air like a festival, but colder. The square began to fill hours before the executions. Children on shoulders, soldiers at attention, vendors selling beer, roasted nuts, and sweet cakes. Entire families arrived with picnic baskets. They weren't there to mourn. They were there to witness. This was not just justice. This was a message. The scaffold had been built days in advance, high, wide, and visible from every corner of the plaza. At its center stood the wheel tall, spoked, designed to break a human body into parts. Nearby, red-hot pincers sat in a brazier. Executioners walked slowly, sharpening blades, adjusting ropes, rehearsing. The Papenheimers were brought out one by one. Paulus came first. He was barely conscious, dragged by 2 guards, his arms hanging useless at his sides. He'd aged 20 years in 2 months. The crowd cheered as he was chained to the post. The bishop gave a final blessing, loud enough for all to hear. Then came the pincers. Glowing red, they tore at his chest, his stomach, his thighs. The crowd gasped. Some turned away. Others leaned in. Flesh sizzled. He screamed until his voice broke. Then they brought out the wheel. His arms and legs were tied across it spread wide. An iron bar came down, slow and methodical, smashing bones one by one. When he was finally still, they hoisted the wheel upright, so his broken body could be displayed to the crowd. He wasn't dead, not yet. Next was Anna. They stripped her in front of everyone. A woman in her 50s, mother of 3, now reduced to a symbol. They cut off her breasts slowly, deliberately, and shoved them into her mouth, then into the mouths of her sons. The crowd gasped, then cheered. She was paraded around the scaffold, her wounds leaking, her body trembling. Then she, too, was strapped to the wheel. Her ribs were shattered. Her spine snapped. When the blows ended, her head hung limp. She had no face left. Gumbrecht and Michel were brought out together. They could barely walk. Their eyes were swollen shut. They tried to speak, but no words came. The executioners took their time. First, they forced them to kiss their mother's mutilated corpse. Then the torture resumed, hot irons to the groin, more pincers, more beatings. When they finally broke their bodies on the wheel, The crowd was silent, not from horror, but from satisfaction. It had all gone according to plan. 4 down, 1 left. Hansel, 10 years old. He was brought to the scaffold, trembling, dressed in a rough white smock. His wrists were bound, his feet bare. The executioners didn't touch him yet. Instead, they made him watch. They paraded him past the corpses of his family, his mother's ruined face, his father's twisted limbs, his brother's broken jaws. He was made to stand beside them while the court read aloud his own confession. That he had joined the family in satanic rites, that he had drunk the blood of infants, that he had danced with demons. The crowd listened in rapt attention. Then they turned to Hansel. They didn't kill him that day, not yet. They sent him back to the Falcon Tower, to sit in the dark with the memory of what he had seen, to wait for the day the flames would come for him too. That day would come on November 26th. They tied him to a post in the same square. They lit the fire themselves. He did not scream. What unfolded that morning in Munich wasn't a legal sentence. It was a performance. From the moment the first crowd arrived, the stage had already been set. Priests circled the square offering blessings. Drummers announced the hour like a parade. City officials stood on raised platforms, their robes pressed, their eyes watchful. The executioners didn't look like brutes. They looked like priests in leather. They knew they were being watched. For weeks, rumors had built up expectations. Mothers told their children, "You'll see what happens to heretics." Bakers raised their prices, knowing the crowds would come. Inns were full. Pickpockets circled. People arrived not just from Munich, but from the countryside, eager to see what God's wrath looked like. The crowd was not one thing. It was many. Some came for justice, others came for blood. Some believed every word the court had published. Others whispered doubts, then silenced themselves. Some stood in stone-faced silence, unwilling to look away. Others laughed, pointing at the broken limbs and mangled flesh as if they were watching a bear baiting. There were children there, many of them perched on shoulders, sitting on the cobblestones. Their parents didn't shield their eyes. They wanted them to see, to remember. "Obey," they said, "or you'll end up like them." As Paulus was broken on the wheel, some wept, others clapped. A drunk man shouted, "Break him again," and no one stopped him. When Anna was stripped and mutilated, a woman near the front crossed herself 3 times and whispered, "The devil is in her eyes." Another woman turned away, tears streaking her face, only to look again, pulled by the sick gravity of spectacle. By the time the sons were brought out, some in the crowd were growing uneasy. The horror was becoming real. The smell of burnt skin, the sound of cracking bone. It wasn't just theater anymore. It was death, slow and raw and intimate. Still, they didn't leave. Even as Gumbrecht's screams went hoarse, even as Michael lost consciousness mid-sentence, even as Anna's body was unrecognizable, they stayed, some with folded arms, some with trembling hands, some with expressions that said, "Maybe we've gone too far." But no one spoke, because to speak was to question, and to question was to risk becoming next. When Hansel was led out, the crowd shifted. A ripple passed through the mass. A child. Wasn't that too much? But the officials didn't hesitate. They had calculated this moment. They knew the power of showing mercy, and they knew the power of denying it. They didn't kill him, not yet. They just made him watch. And that decision, deliberate, precise, did something far more effective than immediate death. It made the people complicit, because now they had seen it all. They had cheered. They had stayed. They had participated. And once you've watched a child stand before the broken corpses of his family, Once you've swallowed your doubt and silenced your shame, you don't ask questions later. You become part of the silence. That's what Maximilian wanted. That's what the church wanted. That's what fear does. After the spectacle ended, after the crowds wandered home and the scaffold was washed down, the little boy remained. Hansel was not released. He was not adopted or forgiven. He was escorted in silence back to the Falcon Tower, back to the same cold cell, same stone walls, same darkness. But something had changed, something irreversible. His world, already fragile, had collapsed entirely. He had watched his family die, and he knew somewhere deep inside that his turn was coming. For weeks, no one spoke to him. He was given food, water, and silence. No more interrogations, no more questions. They didn't need any. The confession had already been written. The script had been performed. The public had been satisfied. Hansel was just a loose end. He must have wondered why they waited. Perhaps they wanted him to break further. Perhaps they believed his survival would give weight to the legend that even a child could be touched by evil. Or maybe they just didn't care anymore. He had served his purpose. We don't know what he thought during those months. There are no letters, no journals, no testimony, just silence. But what we do know is the day came. November 26, 1600. 4 months after his family was executed, Hansel was brought back to the square. He was still 10. His hands had grown thinner. His face was pale, ghost-like. He wore the same white smock as before, a crown of shame in the eyes of the state. There was no wheel this time, only fire. They tied him to a wooden post stacked with kindling. A priest recited a prayer, more out of formality than faith. The crowd wasn't as large as in July. There were no screams, no cheers, just a quiet murmur, the sound of a cold wind rolling over cobblestone. Someone lit the flame, and Hansel, the last of the Papenheimers, was erased. Not because of what he did, but because of who he was. His death didn't make the same waves. There were no public declarations, no speeches, just a few scribbled lines in a court record listing him as a minor accomplice in heresy, a footnote to a lie, a child sacrificed to prove that the justice of the state was absolute. He never stood a chance, and yet his silence in death said more than any confession they could force. The execution of the Papenheimer family was not the end. It was the beginning. Their tortured confessions, fabricated under unbearable pain, were copied, distributed, and cited as evidence of a vast satanic conspiracy. Priests read their statements from pulpits. Judges used them to justify further arrests. The idea that a single family could kill infants, poison wells, and fly to demonic gatherings became fuel for a fire already smoldering in the heart of Bavaria. Within months, dozens more were arrested, travelers, beggars, midwives, anyone who lived outside the lines of respectability. Fear had taken root, and it didn't need evidence to grow, only repetition. The authorities were careful to shape the story. The Papenheimers were never described as poor. They were not described as desperate laborers scraping together a life no one else wanted. Instead, they were painted as deviant, dangerous, almost inhuman. Their deaths were not tragedies, they were cleansings. And the public accepted it. But as the weeks passed, something began to shift. The accusations didn't stop, and eventually they reached people with names, people with land, people with power. A merchant's wife was arrested in Landshut, a town clerk in Ingolstadt, a mid-ranking noble from a respected Catholic family. Their names weren't so easily erased. Their friends asked questions. Their relatives wrote letters. And slowly, Doubt crept in. How could so many people be witches? Why were the accusations always based on torture? Why did the story sound so similar? Too similar. Even Duke Maximilian, the man who had ordered the Papenheimers' destruction, began to worry. Not about justice, about control. A public terrified of witches is easy to rule, but a public terrified of the courts themselves. That's another matter. In private, the Duke ordered a halt to the most extreme trials. He reined in his prosecutors, not with apologies, but with strategy. He wanted to protect the state, not its victims. No one was held accountable. No executioner punished, no judge removed, no priest silenced. The Papenheimers were not exonerated. Their names remained buried beneath charges no one ever proved, their ashes swept away with no marker, no grave, no prayer. But something else lingered. A crack, a hesitation, a question in the minds of people who once cheered. It was too late to save the Papenheimers, but it wasn't too late to remember them. The sun never really shone in Bavaria after the executions. The air was thick-ish weighted with the scent of ash. People moved more quietly. The taverns closed earlier. The laughter of children, once bright and playful, turned into hushed whispers. Some families didn't speak of the executions as if they had never happened. The fear had seeped so deep into their bones, they didn't dare speak its name aloud. But in other corners, the whispers grew louder. The nobles looked over their shoulders more often. Those who had been supporters of Maximilian's crusade against the heretics began to question their loyalty, some privately, others more boldly. The men who had been complicit in the arrest and torture of the Papenheimers felt the first pangs of guilt, though it wasn't enough to turn them against the system. But they knew. They knew this was just the beginning. The executions had been a public spectacle, but what followed was a far deeper tragedy, one that could not be seen in the grand square or heard in the clattering of coins. It was in the homes, in the hearts of people who had stood there and watched, or worse, cheered. Every time a mother whispered to her child to keep quiet, to stay out of sight, she was passing on a lesson. Every time a father nodded when an innocent man was taken in for questioning, or looked the other way when the interrogators came knocking, the system grew stronger. Fear became currency. Maximilian's methods weren't just brutal, they were effective. In the days following the executions, whispers began circulating that the next family was already being hunted. Neighbors looked at each other with suspicion. Friends stopped speaking. In every corner of Bavaria, once clear lines of community loyalty became tangled in a network of fear and distrust. A new kind of order had been established, an order built not on mutual respect or justice, but on a deep, underlying terror that no one dared to challenge. The church took the first opportunity to capitalize on the events, framing the executions as an act of divine justice. The people were encouraged to offer prayers for the souls of the executed family members. But those prayers were woven with a stark message. This fate could be yours if you stray from the true faith. There were always whispers about the details, the fact that the charges against the Papenheimers had been fabricated, the brutal methods used to extract confessions, and the absence of any real evidence. But no one dared to speak too loudly. The ones who had dared before were silenced, either through brute force or the more subtle coercion of social ostracism. The more the people internalized the fear, the more normal it seemed. They no longer saw it as an aberration, a terrifying event that needed to be stopped. It became the way things were. It became the price of living in a world where God and King demanded absolute loyalty. And soon they weren't just watching executions, they were making them happen. The true horror was not the brutality of one family's death, but the realization that the system could destroy any family at any time, using the same twisted logic that had destroyed the Papenheimers. Everyone had something to hide. Everyone had a weakness. Everyone could be dragged down into the mud. The higher you climbed, the further you fell. The poor, once the most vulnerable, now clung to their fragile sense of survival. The powerful, who had once reveled in the fear they had created, grew increasingly paranoid, for they knew that even the smallest rebellion could undo everything they had worked to build. The Papenheimer family was a symptom. Their destruction was not just about religion. It wasn't just about justice or law. It was about power, the power to manipulate belief, to create truth out of lies, to reshape the world based on fear. And in the end, their story became just one more story, just another forgotten name on a monument built with broken bodies, forgotten voices, and the chilling silence that followed. But it didn't end with them. It was only the beginning. The story of the Papenheimers is over. But the truth inside it never ended. What happened in Munich in 1600 wasn't just about a family. It was about a system, a government that needed fear more than fairness, a church that valued obedience more than truth, a crowd that confused punishment with justice, a silence that made it all possible. These weren't monsters. They were people. A father who shoveled waste to feed his children, a mother who inherited shame she never earned, two sons who never had a chance to be anything more than what the world told them they were, and a 10-year-old boy who died with fire in his eyes and no one left to say his name. Their deaths weren't accidental. They were intentional. They were chosen, not because they did something wrong, but because they were powerless, disposable, useful. That's what makes this story timeless. Because the machinery that destroyed the Papenheimers still exists under different flags, in different languages, with new justifications, it's in every system that punishes poverty while excusing wealth, every courtroom where truth bends under pressure, every street where the voiceless are asked to prove their worth before they're allowed to live in peace. It's easy to look back and say, that would never happen now. But it already has. In Salem, in Tulsa, in the Deep South, in detention centers and prisons and neighborhoods where names vanish after headlines fade. What makes a Papenheimer isn't where they lived or what century they were born into. It's how they were seen, how they were ignored, how they were used, and how quickly we forget them. That's why this story matters not because it's rare, but because it isn't. Because as long as we allow fear to outweigh truth, cruelty to pass as justice, and silence to win over witness, the scaffold will always be waiting. It just needs a name. So say theirs. Say Paulus, say Anna, say Gumbrecht, say Mikkel, say Hansel. Not as martyrs, not as saints, but as people. People who deserve to live